Good morning. We stand today at the cusp of the greatest adventure in human history, the expansion of humanity out past the surly bounds of Earth, out past Leo, returning, going forward to the moon, near-Earth objects onto Mars and beyond. You know, in boardrooms, in classrooms across the world, in high bays and in libraries, in governmental chambers and in public squares, men and women, people of all cultures and creeds and all generations are working together to make this a reality. This isn't flights of fancy, this isn't PowerPoint. This is happening today. You know, when you look at the amazing images that I saw this week from the Hayabusa 2 mission, which is international. It's got DLR, mascot, it's got a Connect sensor. When you see things like that, or the recent announcement of Astrobotics working with Ecuador and Colombia to start putting landers on the surface, or China's Jade Rabbit and the Chang'e 6 mission to go to the far side of the moon. These things are happening today. The inner solar system is awash with the robotic precursors. So 2 years ago, Tony and I had the privilege of sharing a vision for how we would start on this journey that would take us, the human race, to Mars orbit using today's systems and today's technologies to begin that transformational aspect that's going to not just rewrite history, but open a whole new book on history.
And then last year, we showed you how the assembly and test of the gateway and the operations were all leading to the path to exploration of the moon, scientifically and from a resource perspective. And then we also showed you the reusable, refuelable Mars lander.
So this year, we want to, as my kids would say, connect the dots. We want to show you how this is a continual story arc, put the whole picture together from Earth to the moon and onto Mars and beyond.
So we'll start this morning with showing you what we've already done as far as expanding and extending human exploration of deep space. And then we will show you how you can do reusable, refuelable human lunar exploration based on the work that we've done with our Mars reusable lander.
And then we're going to talk about that iconic image of lights coming on in the lunar night and how commercial working hand in hand with government agencies can help to realize this, working together and supporting one another. And we'll talk about the exciting opportunities that are developing today that make that an exciting proposition.
And then this is all on a path to human exploration of Mars. It's not the moon or Mars, it's the moon and Mars. It's not industry or government, it's industry and government. And IAC's 28 theme has captured it perfectly, including everyone.
When we get to the end today, we're going to need your help, actually, because this path has already started, and today we're going to be looking for ideas from you for a new activity, and Tony's going to share that at the end with one of our special guests. But first, before I forget, for those of you here in the conference or online in real time, please give us your questions. Tony said if you could give us the answers too, that would be really appreciated. If you go to the IAF Astro app and you go all the way to the bottom, it says Ask a Question. And it'll pop up the code to use next to the hashtag, or as Tony calls it, the number sign. That's IAC, and you can give us questions, and we're going to reserve a chunk of time at the end here for your questions that we'll provide answers to. So with that, I want to introduce our colleague Danielle, who's going to take us on the start of this journey, what we're doing today.
Thanks, Rob. So let's talk about how we're starting exploration beyond low Earth orbit today. We actually started a couple years ago with the launch of Exploration Flight Test 1. It was Orion's first mission out beyond the Van Allen belts and back safely to Earth. Now, not only was this the first test flight of Orion, but it also set up an important premise, something that we've talked a lot about today with that word, that phrase, the PPP, or private-public partnerships. Now, Exploration Flight Test 1 really was a services contract. We set it up such that we purchased the Delta IV Heavy rocket that you saw launching here. We operated it from launch, safely landing, and then we delivered data to NASA from the instrumentation on the spacecraft. This is important to think about as we move forward into space and exploration today, those relationships and those new procurement methods that NASA's talked about at this conference. And as we move forward into deep space exploration, we're getting ready to launch our next mission, Exploration Mission 1. Now, those of you here in Bremen know that the European Service Module is being prepared just down the street, and within a month it'll ship to Kennedy Space Flight Center. This mission will integrate Orion, the Space Launch System, as well as the ground system at KSC, setting the stage and the foundation for our future human deep space exploration. Following that, Exploration Mission 2 will launch humans further into space than ever before. These missions are precursors to really moving out beyond low Earth orbit. Now, with Exploration Mission 3, we'll move on to the Gateway, which you've heard a lot about today. Now, this is a fully built-up gateway. It's really a waypoint around lunar orbit. It's not a destination, but a place to dock, perform science, go down to the lunar surface, or head off to Mars and beyond. It's comprised of a power and propulsion element, a habitat, utility module, which is more living and working space, an EVA module with an airlock, and a cargo module containing supplies for the crew. Now, you'll also notice that there happens to be an arm that looks very similar to Canadarm on the ISS, and that's by design. Now, the Gateway is meant to be that kind of services or commercial, international, public partnerships that we've been talking about here today. It's everybody involved together in moving out beyond low Earth orbit to the moon. The PPE is the first element, and it's meant to be a kind of a commercial satellite-based element that will launch on a commercial launch vehicle. And we're starting those procurements today, and we'll move into those developments next year. Now, with the Gateway, you might ask, what are astronauts going to do? Well, 4 astronauts, starting off with 30-day missions, will live and work for, about 30 days in a rather small space, but still have enough room to perform valuable science, work on those operation principles that will be really important as we move out to Mars, especially with the time delay that we're not quite used to yet from the space station. Another really important piece to the Gateway is it's untended 11 months out of the year. And so for us, understanding how to telerobotically operate elements at the Gateway from Earth will be critical in starting science experiments, stopping them, cleaning the Gateway, preparing it for those future human missions. These videos here show examples of how we're getting ready to perform those telerobotic operations. You can see an operator on the right-hand side using a Vive headset and hand controllers to operate a robotic arm that would potentially be on the Gateway. Telerobotic operations is an important part to the Gateway, and we're starting to plan that today. Now, during this phase of exploration at the moon, you can see you've got a power and propulsion element, that first element of the Gateway showing up. You've had a couple Orion missions, and then you're doing surface lunar exploration with rovers and landers. Now, you're you're really trying to prove out the concepts for landing on the moon and then starting to prospect for volatiles as well as valuable water ice that you might turn into propellant. These landers and rovers are paving the way, like the one you see here. It's the Audi Lunar Quattro from Part-Time Scientists, a German company here, that are really setting the stage for how do those commercial and international partnerships help participate in this lunar landscape, trying to set up those long-term missions that will allow us to safely live and work on the moon, and then in the future, Mars. So speaking of the future, my colleague Tim Sheehan is going to take you through that future.
Thanks, Danielle. So all those things that we are working today are necessary to enable the future, this next phase, which is putting humans on the surface of the moon. So this is the view that the first international crew to land on the moon would see as they were coming in for a landing. And this time, the exploration campaign is going to be one of sustainable, long-term exploration of the moon. So we've come up with a concept, a precursor vehicle to our Mars base camp ascent-descent vehicle. As we talked about last year, that Mars vehicle is a fully reusable vehicle that operates out of the Mars base camp vehicle in orbit. It's a sortie vehicle, so it leaves orbit, it goes down to the surface of Mars. The astronauts of 4 crew spend about 2 weeks exploring a site and then back up into orbit. And what we wanted to do as we thought about lunar exploration is, hey, what would a precursor vehicle to that Mars vehicle do? So same requirements, 4 crew, about 2-week duration, operating out of orbit, and now we're operating out of the gateway, and accessing multiple landing locations across the moon. But there are significant environmental differences between the moon and Mars. There's less gravity, there's no atmosphere, and so when we took a look at the design, we certainly didn't need the aeroshell and the thermal protection system of a Mars lander, but so many of the systems are common that it is quite valuable if you architect the lander from the beginning to test out the technologies and the operations for Mars. So that's what this single-stage vehicle is, operating out of the gateway. And at least for the initial missions, we wanted to refuel in orbit. And that way, we don't need to pre-place a lot of in-situ resource equipment on the moon at first. But as we go through the exploration campaign, we'll switch to an operations where we're refueling both in orbit and on the surface, and that'll enable some interesting missions. One of the technologies we chose is hydrogen and oxygen propulsion for both of these vehicles. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One is that the high efficiency of hydrogen and oxygen really enables these types of missions, fully reusable, single-stage, orbit to surface and back. But perhaps more importantly is the fact that using electricity and water, you can make these propellants. And water is available throughout the solar system. So we really want to get to that future state of water being delivered in a competitive commercial environment to the lunar orbit, to Mars orbit, from multiple sources, from Earth, from the moon, from asteroids, and of course, we also know that there are lots of ice deposits on Mars. Another system that is common to this lunar lander and the Mars lander is the use of Orion systems. Orion has been architected from the beginning as a deep space sortie vehicle, an exploration class spaceship for people. And so its systems, computers, software, crew displays, life support, they are all already being produced, and they are the right systems to use in a vehicle of this kind. There's no need to redo development for the systems we have. We need to focus on systems that we don't have. And other systems for this lander, such as the descent and navigation, and the propulsion systems are directly feed forward to the Mars lander. So by having access across the surface of the moon, we can do science and exploration, do things that only people are capable of, making those split decisions, understanding the environment, working closely with robotic partners, and getting to new places. See the long shadows here, we can go to the polar regions. So this is a chart of some of the interesting locations on the surface of the moon from a science perspective. The moon has a lot to teach us, and there's a lot we don't learn. There's a lot we haven't learned. The Apollo missions explored less than 5% of the lunar surface. And the moon can tell us a lot. The moon can tell us data on how the solar system formed, on how the moon formed. We know that there's recent volcanic activity as recent as 100 million years ago. And also, we are finding that there is a lot of lunar volatiles, including water, ice on the moon. And even this year, there was a paper that took data sets from previous orbiting missions like the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and Chandrayaan-1 from the Indian Space Research Organization and used modern techniques to analyze that data. And the water that's in the polar regions, and this is a picture of the lunar South Pole, and you can see all of the blue dots. The water's there, it's close to the surface, but there's still a lot we don't understand. How accessible is it? How easy will it be to capture into systems and create that hydrogen and oxygen propellants? So now at the end of this phase, a little bit more activity going on. Of course, lunar landers and rovers exploring the surface of the moon. Probably have a few sorties with crew to different locations. And maybe by this point we are putting down an outpost on the lunar surface. Probably not a permanently tended outpost, but one that crews visit from time to time. And there's a picture of a pressurized rover there. And one thing that we know is that this is going to be an international endeavor. That lander is a concept intended for the space agencies of the world to develop. The Global Exploration Roadmap, which was released this year, which is a collaboration among many space agencies, had also a lunar lander concept and pressurized rovers, and that was a 42-day mission. And those space agencies were working together to come up with that concept. And I think that that's the way lunar landers will be designed and built. But of course, building on today's technologies, Orion and the Gateway are key. The Gateway really enables full reusability in the landers in a reasonably complex system. And then pushing off to Mars. So next, Rob is going to talk about how industry can help space agencies achieve this vision and how space agencies can enable commercial activity at the moon.
Thank you, Tim. It's like I was saying earlier, I don't know about you guys, but for me, the most iconic image that gives me goosebumps about the development at the moon is this, the idea of lights flickering on in the lunar night and pushing back that darkness. And maybe it's because of, the poets and storytellers and all of us that have this vision of a candle pushing back the darkness in uncharted territory, or the scientist and engineer nerds like me within us that are like, wow, there's a lot of infrastructure in place, communications and power and logistics. It gives you a sense of the transformation that can occur at the moon with the combination of those first two phases, which are government-led, and then the introduction of thoughtful, incredible approaches to commercial activity. So what would those look like? How can we sort of visualize how this goes from this initial infrastructure being set up by government into a thriving economy with the Earth and the moon that would then propel us onward towards Mars? So we kind of see it as a new market. And at this point, over the next 3.5 hours, I'm going to talk to you about each one of these items on the, I'm just kidding around. There is a lot of potential at the moon. You saw that the initial pictures, and these aren't just fanciful concepts, these are real applications that are going to be needed very quickly. Everything from mining and refining to produce power, rocket fuel, air, drinking water. ISRU for power generation, like with kilopower. Navigation and communication services in orbit. Science payloads, sample returns, and ultimately larger human presence on the surface, including those huts with the candles that are holding back the night. So we see it as kind of a three-phase set of activities that are going to happen. It'll start with what we're doing successfully here in low Earth orbit. Privatized government services, commercial cargo is a great example of that. It's where the government is really the only customer. It's a government contract, sure, but they're able to push down technologies, engineering solutions that the space agencies have developed and allow commercial industry to implement those when the risk tolerance is high and the payloads are perhaps of lower value, so that those kinds of decisions make sense. So we show here the picture of the water electricity system, which kind of like to call the water cracker, that is used to produce fuel for that reusable lunar lander like we talked about. But where it gets exciting is when you get to the next step, true commercial market endeavors, where you're not just selling to government agencies, but to other commercial entities, other users. So our thanks to our colleagues here at Made in Space. You know, they've revolutionized the concept of a tool crib on orbit, right? Tool crib is actually just a chunk of plastic, and you throw it in, and you order Earl Grey hot and tool number 72, and it comes out, right? At least the tool does today. Still working on the T generation machine. This type of thing is used not just by government agencies, but by other users out in Gateway and in cislunar space. Or on the right-hand side, infrastructure. So that's a kilopower station being worked on by NASA and other agencies and industry throughout the world. And that opens up transmission lines and distribution hubs and power conditioning, all of which can be used with the space agencies as the anchor tenant, but used by other users, reducing the barrier of entry for people to get out into cislunar space. Probably a great example of that is the Audi Quattro, Lunar Quattro, Audi Lunar Quattro that part-time scientists work with Audi and Vodafone and others. The concept of reducing that barrier of entry, even though at this case, both commercial and government are the customers. And then where it gets, for me, the most exciting and interesting is when space agencies are just a small part of the customer base for an activity. If you look at the upper right, thanks to our friends from NanoRacks for giving us some footage. This is obviously from the space station with the Earth in the background. But data is a product that Earthlings will pay for. Whether it's data about space weather, from the great vantage point that NRHO orbit that Danielle and Tim have talked about, that great vantage point that gives us view of the sun. Or it's a wonderful spot to which observe the Earth, because we'll always have that in view from the Gateway. That type of data is valuable to Earthlings. The lower right-hand side, you tap into pharmaceuticals and biomedicine, understanding the radiation environment out there, which is significantly different from here in low Earth orbit. Out there, we're able to look at perhaps the effects on bodily tissues and DNA, and getting into cutting-edge pharmaceuticals that we haven't even thought about today. And that would improve the life of everybody in this room and online and in fact on our planet. You know, space, zero gravity, right? You don't have to withstand launch loads. So having regolith from the moon, or even brought up in densified packages, and then doing on-orbit manufacturing out at the moon in a great low-energy orbit that you can then come back to Earth. And so you see here on the lower left, again, our friends at Made in Space, their concept for Archinaut to build large structures that could revolutionize communications and our life here on Earth. And again, it's something that Earthlings will pay for beyond just the space agency. who are also Earthlings at this point. I know that. Don't ask a question about that particular topic. And then finally, tourism, right? You know, tourism is probably the most exciting long-term prospect for closing a commercial economy, but it requires having all of these other activities and infrastructures in place to reduce that barrier of cost. That's very exciting. So we're going to talk a little bit later today about how we're starting today on some of these commercial activities, and that's where we're going to need your help, and Tony's going to introduce that. But first, Tony, why don't you take us to Mars?
All right, thanks, Rob. So from a robotic exploration of Mars today, Mars is a crowded place. I think using the diversity 3G model, right? We have scientists and engineers around the globe participating in robotic exploration of Mars. We've got the ISRO Mars orbiting mission in orbit around Mars today. We have the United Arab Emirates HOPE mission being designed and built today. A little closer to where we are today in Bremen, the ExoMars rover just this spring started its thermal vac testing. So from a robotic exploration of Mars, Mars is a crowded place, and many more. I don't have time to list them all. Next, from a test pilot perspective, all of the technologies and the operations that Danielle and Tim and Rob explained for exploring the moon, both for scientific purposes and for resource utilization, right? In addition to that, you get the testing close to home, what John Young would have referred to as 3 days away from a can of beans. The technologies to do the lunar exploration are the same technologies you can use to do Mars exploration. And now this is human Mars exploration, and where we have a lot of room to improve from geography, gender, and generation. But these technologies are being built today or being developed. The same messages that we've said the last 2 years. So from an Orion command deck perspective, keeping the crew alive in deep space for a round trip to Mars and back. From an advanced in-space propulsion perspective with chemical engines and also high-power solar electric propulsion and long-duration life support. Hopefully you heard the news that there's a new CO2 removal system that just launched on the JAXA mission, but it was a European rack that's going to do the next generation of CO2 removal, and we're going to test that on the International Space Station here real soon, just as soon as they get that rack installed. And then, just like Tim showed you, the reusable, refuelable lander, I'll remind you that this technology is all extensible to the exploration of Mars. So the gravity environment on the moon and on Mars with LOX hydrogen propulsion allows you to do single stage round trips from orbit to the surface and back to orbit, or in the future when we have propulsion plants set up on the surface, we can refuel on the surface in the future. But this is what I personally hope to see in my lifetime. Really excited about seeing folks climb out of the lander on the moon, which I have not seen in a while, just like the rest of us on the planet. The idea that we're going to explore, I believe we as humans still have a lot to learn, and we're going to explore, expand the human knowledge, and bring that back to Earth for the benefit of all. That first step looks pretty high. I'm personally kind of afraid of heights, so I'll let somebody else, I think, take that first look and view. And then including everyone, right? Which I mentioned, it's not the moon and Mars. It's not robots or humans. It's robots and humans exploring together. And this is doable today with today's technology. So I'm really excited about that. And now, literally including everyone, I'd like to invite Jeff Manber up to the stage to join me. Jeff is the president and co-founder of NanoRacks, one of the most successful companies at commercializing low Earth orbit.
Good
Jeff,
morning.
welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
So Jeff, tell us a little bit, I think a lot of folks know, but not everyone, a little bit about what NanoRacks has been able to accomplish to date.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here with Lockheed Martin to explore the commercial opportunities of deep space. When we started NanoRacks 9 years ago, we were the first company in the world to own and market our own hardware on the International Space Station. We were the first company to talk about prices and talk about profit, which I'm still waiting for. But anyway, we were able to talk about profit. And it reflected the growing public-private partnership that we have with NASA and a growing number of companies like Made in Space and others have with NASA. So it's been an evolution of how on the space station we have customers in 32 nations now. We've sent over 700 payloads, 200 satellites, and we've done it with private sector financing using the facilities paid for by the taxpayer.
Wow, 32 nations, 700 payloads. We're getting very close to including everyone. That is fantastic. So I know you can't share all of your trade secrets, but can you tell us a little bit about what are the keys to commercializing low Earth orbit?
Yeah, great question. For us at NanoRacks, and I think for our friends at Lockheed Martin, there's three key pillars that we look at. The first is reduce cost. And with Orion, we're excited at looking at commercial opportunities with Orion because it will have a robust architecture. It will be known to the customer. We'll be using principles we learned in low Earth orbit, and we're comfortable that we can assure the customer that the cost will be commercially viable. A second is standardized hardware. It's very important to the industry, to NASA, to our colleagues around the world that we have the ability to swap hardware, to have someone begin a mission in LEO and then go to deep space. And so standardization is an extremely important part of commercial activities. And the third, which I know both Lockheed Martin and NanoRacks are obsessed on, is customer service. And in commercial, we live and die every day by customer service. And so we're very comfortable as we look out at the Orion that we'll be able to provide commercial services to a degree that we have in LEO based on customer service and based on the robust architecture of Orion.
Excellent, thanks. So specifics on the call for inputs, right? And this is everyone. This is whether you're anywhere you are on the Earth. We're looking for your ideas on how you would use Orion. I'll quickly run down some of Orion's capabilities from a standardization perspective that Jeff mentioned. So gigabit Ethernet, access to pressurized volume, access to crew, just like Jeff uses on the International Space Station, and potential payloads. So what we're looking for is your ideas. If you'll go to the Lockheed Martin website and let us know if you had access to services on Orion, what would you do? And this will be the start. Just like NASA's looking at commercializing low Earth orbit, and Jeff's actually working on today, we want to start now thinking about when we do human exploration of cislunar space with the gateway, the lunar surface, and then onto Mars, what commercial interests will follow the government's exploration plans. So the website's here on the bottom. Hopefully that comes through on the video, but it's lockheedmartin.com/fly-on-Orion. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Great, thank you. Looking forward to it. Thank you, everybody.
So I'll invite Rob and Danielle and Tim back up here, and we will transition. It's hopefully Kat is out there in the audience, and we got some good questions, so I'll remind you. We've got a few minutes left. If you haven't gotten your questions in yet, type those in on the on the IAC app.
Next to the tic-tac-toe sign, put IAC.
It's the number sign, Rob. Kat, what do you got? Do you have some so far?
We have more than we have time for, that's for sure. And sorry, I'm still moderating through them all. So let's see, for the first one, so I'm Kat Codere from Lockheed Martin. I guess this one is really for Tim. Can you share details on the tech specs on the cryo-human lander?
Sure. So from a delta V perspective, so how much change in velocity the lander can do, that's about 5 kilometers per second, and that covers that round trip from the gateway's orbit, the near rectilinear halo orbit, down to any point on the surface of the moon, and then back up to the gateway. And from a mass perspective, it's about 60 metric tons of mass, and 40 metric tons of that mass is propellant. 4 crew for about 2 weeks.
Okay. Let's see. This one says, how does NASA feel about commercial activities on Orion missions? I give that to Rob.
I'll take that. So, no, they're very interested. You know, they haven't committed to flying anything, but when we sat with them and we said this has been a great activity, of course, with NanoRacks' help as sort of having paved the way for almost an existence proof, right, on ISS. And there were RFIs, requests for information, that NASA sent out earlier this year about similar activities at the Gateway. And we said, you know, what about the piece in between? We're going to be flying Orion, and she's got a lot of capabilities. As you home in on a particular mission, you get to understand fully what the margins are that cover the whole envelope, that requirements, and anytime return, anytime, anywhere, and getting you off the coast of California. So you can turn those capabilities, when you have a particular mission, into payloads, quite honestly. And so we sat down with NASA, and they said, you know, that's actually great. Go get that information. Let's just start seeing what that market might look like and what the arrangements are. What would we need to bake into the Orion design today? As you know, we're getting to the point where Orion goes into production with our stated public target of getting to a half of the cost ultimately in production that we are during the development phase, that build-to-print mentality. And so the sooner we scar it for any of these capabilities we want, power and data and so forth, the better. So NASA was really interested in gathering that data. And then late spring, early next summer, after we've got inputs from all of you, both on the Earth and off, if anybody up in station has ideas, Tony did not mean to just include his own former astronaut friends. So we'll include those as well. And then early next summer, sit down with NASA and say, here's what we found, and explore it from there. So they're interested in getting the info.
So let me take a second just to go into greater detail on Orion's capabilities, right? So I said pressurized volume. That includes trips out past the moon farther than humans have ever been. It also ensures return of your payloads. There's unpressurized volume, which could make the trip or be deployed from the SLS or the Orion and European Service Module. There's high bandwidth data that's part of the Orion spacecraft. There's gigabit Ethernet. Orion was the first spacecraft to be designed with radiation requirements for humans, and of course all of that applies to any of the payloads. There's crew access. From that perspective, just like on the space station, whatever you would need done on the Orion mission. Did I leave anything out?
On-site IT support from the astronauts.
Yeah, that comes with the combination of the crew having access to the payload and the high-speed bandwidth back to Earth. So you got on-site access and support, and then you also have the ability to send the data back to Earth and get help from the 7 billion smart people that are still here.
But Tony, I think the other thing is that where Orion's going out to the moon, going out past the radiation belts, going into that environment, and so that's new access.
Yeah, actually, one of the She said we have more questions than we can answer, but let me just sneak this one in. It was actually pretty interesting. It was one of the reasons why we sat down and talked to NanoRacks and then got with NASA. We were at the ISS R&D conference, and somebody came up and he said, even in the vacuum of ISS, in LEO, there's still a lot of atomic oxygen, and we're interested in the cold, hard, clean vacuum outside of that for some specialized materials stuff that I didn't fully comprehend. But that was fascinating. That was interesting. We talked a lot about radiation being different, but the vacuum environment is a little more pure, and that might actually be useful or is useful for some of the folks we talked to. So that's why we realized we really needed to put out a call for inputs, because we're not exactly sure what questions to ask. But speaking of questions.
And then one more. The bounds of commercialization. We're not going to get through any of the questions, are we? The bounds of commercialization in this call for inputs is wide, right? So I think there's still plenty of opportunity for commercial, if you'll allow me a broad definition, right, for science applications, right? All of the science that needs to be done in cislunar space and that's on the lunar surface and that is more capable from the lunar surface, and radio astronomy from the far side is the one that jumps to the top of my mind, right? All of that doesn't have to be government-led. It can absolutely be for commercial in the broad sense applications.
Hey, Danielle, do you want to drag this one out anymore?
Okay, so here's one. Is the Gateway replacing the International Space Station?
I'll take that one since you guys have already stole the stage. So as you've heard a lot about the Gateway, it is not ISS 2.0. It is not replacing the Gateway. The ISS is very much alive and well in low Earth orbit. It's performing critical science and will do so in the future. The Gateway is really meant to be that waypoint, not the destination, not a permanently tended human station. It's meant to get humans, hopefully women, to the lunar surface. It's meant to get people out to the moon and out to Mars as well.
Yeah, the thing that I'm excited about the Gateway is that its role as a logistics node, so high in the gravity well of Earth, and it provides access to the lunar surface, provides access to Mars. These vehicles are, like the Mars Base Camp vehicle is 75% propellant by mass. So there's a lot of logistics that needs to be done, and we know from the space station, from Antarctica, from other dangerous endeavors that logistics are so important.
We were talking last night about is there a penalty actually from a lunar surface, particularly for human missions, by going by the Gateway? And Tony, you had some strong thoughts.
Yeah, so that's a good point. That so the reusable, refuelable lander, both at the moon for lunar access and at Mars, 75-80% fuel. That fuels water. Liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. So not 75 or 80% of the cost, right? We can get the development done. We can get I'll say the brains, the command deck. And with the Gateway, we can now reuse that. So refuelable, reusable lunar lander, global access to the lunar surface, and that same concept tested out at the moon, a lot of the exact same technologies, just adding a skin or a heat shield, and you can do that from Mars orbit to the surface of Mars. You gain all that, what does it cost you? So I think you've seen folks on Earth land in first stages. A couple of companies have been doing that the last few years. For low Earth orbit missions, I believe it's about 3% of the first stage propellant to be able to return that first stage and land it. Which doesn't sound like a lot, sounds like a great deal if in the future it leads to an order of magnitude reduction in launch costs. It's a pretty straightforward path, and it makes a lot of sense. And hopefully we get to that point really soon to allow access to low Earth orbit for everyone. That 3% fuel translates differently depending on how far away you want to go from Earth or how fast you want to go. If you're just going to low Earth orbit, it's a relatively small penalty. If you want to go farther and faster, that penalty gets extrapolated. So from the Gateway, and one of the the benefits of the gateway, right? We talked about global access to the lunar surface, accessible with today's launch vehicles. It's about somewhere between 1% and 6% penalty from a Delta V perspective, and think all the different pieces. Orion's service module has propulsion capability, the gateway with solar electric propulsion has propulsion capability, and then your reusable, refuelable lander has to make up the difference. That's about a 1% to 6% penalty in Delta V. And for that small penalty, you get reusable, refuelable first stage landers. So I think just like land and first stages seems like the wave of the future, accessing surfaces, lunar surface and Mars surface from orbiting outposts or gateways makes a lot of sense.
I've actually got one on here that is maybe a good follow-up to that one. Basically, what are we giving up going to the gateway first instead of starting on the surface and then having a gateway or an orbital support?
Yeah, and as Tony was talking about, there's a little bit of fuel there that is required to go and to stop and dock at the gateway, but it's at a very good point to be doing that stop. So there's a little bit of mass penalty there, but then it opens up the possibilities for reusability.
Sorting as fast as I can, hold on.
We threw you off with a short answer. That's not usually our technique, is it? Sorry
I'm
about
not
that.
used to the short answers from you guys. Usually I have time. Okay, actually, I like this one. We're talking about the moon and how we can go from the moon to Mars. Are we certain that this really isn't a pivot away from Mars, all this focus on the moon, that we might actually kind of be here for a while and not really be able to push the boundaries? I added some words onto that one. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, let me shoot that one. We get this question a lot. Gosh, why did you guys pivot to talk about the moon? And we went back and looked at our charts 2 years ago, and we were like, well, maybe we just didn't talk enough about the space port at the moon that we would need to use to build up the systems. You're not going to go straight from the surface of the Earth all the way to the moon. From a F equals ma physics perspective, that just doesn't close and make a lot of sense given today's technologies and systems that we want to apply. So the high Earth orbit, the higher you go, lower energy from there out to Mars, so you can make use of more efficient engines. And so there's one particular high Earth orbit that's of particularly interesting benefit, which is the one with the moon in it. And so the gateway, or a space port or a space dock where you can assemble those Martian systems, was always part of our concept, and we just didn't emphasize it too much. It was part of the development test. So really, when people have talked about a pivot, there's no pivot. The path to Mars has always taken us past the moon, frankly. What is new is the concept of the lander. Of course, we talked about you get to the gateway, you build up the systems, you go out to Mars, and you land on the surface of Mars with the Mars lander. But you would need to test that out anyway. And so it's really a question of how much do you test that out at the moon with doing lunar landings with humans, and how much infrastructure do you put in place there to support the commercial economy that can develop up before you continue to move out to Mars. So from our perspective, really this is just part of the plan that we, the human race, have been on for several years now.
Yeah, and I'll even bring it in, just not all the way back to the surface of Earth, but a little closer, right? So we're using the International Space Station today. Danielle took that question, but we didn't frame it in this sense, right? So we're also not pivoting away from low Earth orbit. So we're using the International Space Station for science purposes. We're using the International Space Station to test the equipment that we'll need for these deep space missions, expeditions. And as Jeff was up here, and we're asking for your inputs, right? We're using the International Space Station for commercial purposes. And so the plan will be Orion, the Gateway, and the lunar surface for those same three, right? There's science reasons to go and explore cislunar space and the lunar surface. There's commercial interest, and there's my favorite. I can't believe I almost forgot it. And exploration reasons, right? We need to go and explore, and all of those same three are extensible to Mars.
Right, and with the objective being Mars, we need to be very careful, and we need to architect all of the systems and the operations and the plans with that goal in mind. And I think we need deep space is difficult at exploration, and we need to be as lean as possible and as quick as possible as we move through our developments and tests and missions.
Okay, we'll go slightly back to a little more technical one. There's been a couple of questions, and this is probably for you, Tim, on the lander. And they're wondering, where does the water come from for the refueling? Like, how does that whole process work?
Where does the water come from?
Yeah.
Obviously, we know there's water on Earth, and so I think initially the water will come from Earth. And we could just launch cryogenic propellants, and maybe that's the first delivery. But I think we really want to get to that water delivery. And if you think about what it would take to launch just water from the surface of the Earth, a payload that is inexpensive, I think there might be a whole new class of launch vehicles or launch systems that can get that water out to the moon. Things that don't necessarily need to be as reliable as the rockets that today carry very important payloads. So, water on Earth. As we move further and further into the future, as I talked about, we need to understand if the water on the surface of the moon is accessible and easy to turn into propellant. I think that answer is going to be yes, but we got to get the data. So lunar surface is a great place. And then as we move towards Mars, perhaps asteroids. There's lots of asteroids that have high water concentrations. And then Mars itself has lots of water ice deposits. So, water is just found throughout the solar system. And I think that, Earth first, then the moon, then asteroids.
And real quick, human explorers throughout time have been stopping and staying at places on Earth with water for the obvious reason of us needing water. Now, human space explorers are going to do the same, but for two other reasons. In addition to the water they need to drink, right, they're going to break it down and use it for the oxygen they need to breathe. And then human space explorers, in addition to Earth explorers, need rocket fuel. So we'll also use that for rocket propellant.
Okay, we have a few more minutes. There's quite a few questions that touch on, the themes of both commercial and actually international contributions. So if maybe one of you could talk a little bit about some of, maybe more of the international side.
Yeah, I think international contributions have played a big part in the space station, as we've seen, obviously, with the Kibo module, the Canadarm, along with all the other international contributions. And we're continuing that into the Gateway. As I mentioned earlier, we're starting with Orion, with ESM being built down the road, which is a critical component to getting us out to the moon. You can't go very far without your propellant or your service module or with power. And then also at the Gateway, you're seeing a lot of international contributions. Anybody that's seen the NASA presentations, it's been incredibly integral into their plans. They're talking about the Esprit module, they're talking about a Canadarm3, and then also landers and cargo modules that could either be commercial or international. So international is still a very strong component and is critical to making the Gateway a viable spaceport. And then the commercial component is also critical in that aspect. We talked about lowering launch costs earlier this week. We talked about how with Orion we're trying to cut those costs by 50% with our production line. And so as we start to move into that commercial mindset, you're able to go further as you can build partnerships both internationally and commercially in order to get further into space, not just in orbit on the Gateway, but also to the lunar surface and, of course, Mars.
And we've got lots of experience working with international partners. And even right now, the InSight Mars lander is more than halfway to Mars. Lockheed Martin built that lander for NASA. But the two main instruments are from DLR and from GNF. So we've got between Orion and InSight and all the way back into the history. Lockheed Martin's got experience, and the space agencies have experience, and the international industry teams all have experience working together. And so we're ready to keep moving forward.
And then maybe one last question, since we have just maybe a minute left, if you can make it short. Maybe this is more of a Tim or a Rob. Can you expand more on the gateway and how that applies to Mars? I know we touched on it in the presentation, but maybe at a high level.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about the bits and pieces, so maybe I kind of summarize it up. If you guys go away with one thing today from our discussion, I hope it's that there hasn't been some pivot or change. We're on the path that we've been on for years, we, the human race. The initial pieces that Danielle talked about, Orion and SLS, and building up the gateway, first humans forward to the moon, creating that economy that then can propel us on towards the first orbital mission to Mars, like Mars Base Camp, and then down to the surface. That's a continual arc. It's a continuity or constancy of purpose, and that activity is starting right now. The solar system is awash with the robotic precursors, and high bays across the world are awash with the hardware that's going to take us there. So we're on the path, and let's keep pressing.
I'd just like to close with 2 points. So I'll remind, so folks watching online, the next presentation is on the JAXA Hayabusa 2 mission, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. I'd love to stand up here and answer questions, but we got to get to that presentation. So, but as a final reminder, if you'll go to lockheedmartin.com/flyonorIon and give us your commercial ideas for what you would do with access to the world's first exploration class spacecraft. And then I'd like, as a nod to the next presentation, to add Konnichiwa Ugu.
Thank you.